Assalamu alaikum. My name is Hasan Zaidi. I'm a journalist and a one-time filmmaker. And we are in conversation today with, I'll be in conversation today with...
All yourselves.
With Kamila, who is, I've known for very long, but now she's a very, very celebrated writer of 8 books, 8 novels, among other things. And I was telling her earlier that there was a time where in every writer's life where you can list all their books, but she's now come to the point where usually you can now say, just mention her last book or the last 2 books, because there are too many to list. But she's been writing novels since, her first novel was published in 1998, and the latest one was from 2022, called Best of Friends. And if I'm sure some of you have read all of them, you can see the evolution in her as a writer, but we'll touch upon that as well. Before we start, I just want to say, so we have about an hour, so we will try and have our discussion initially for about, let's say, 40 minutes, and we'll leave the last 20 minutes for questions. My one request, as always in everything that we ever do here, is that when you ask a question, please limit it to a question, so it's not just a statement, so it's something that you want to ask Kamila. So Kamila, before we begin, I actually want to start with something that is, I guess, bothering me, but it's bothering a lot of people, which is that in the kind of world we live in, I mean, the title of this session is called Weaving Worlds with Words.
Say that 10 times fast.
Yeah. But what happens when those words also can weave worlds, right? And in the kind of dystopian world that we're living in right now, can your writing remain unscathed?
I mean, when were we ever living in a vacuum or an innocent world where writing didn't have all kind of pressures exerted on it? I mean, my first book came out in 1998, which means most of my published life has been as someone who is published in multiple places of the world, but my primary publishers are the UK. And I've spent most of my life, my publishing life, therefore being a Muslim post 9/11. There's no such thing as a writer who is not writing within history. And that is has been true forever. History, I think, is feeling particularly dark at the moment. And I think particularly the last year and a half, I mean, there's that phrase that gets used about people in the part of the world in which I've spent much of my life, which is progressive except Palestine. And it always used to be that if you were a writer, you would move among certain circles, and there would be all kinds of sort of basic shared assumptions. 9/11 dented that, and the genocide in Gaza has dented that further. But when you sit down to write, there is a way in which writing has to both absolutely engage with the world and then also has to absolutely occur in a space where you are sitting in a desk and you have to think, what does this novel want? You cannot say, what do I want to say? How will the world be reading me? If any of that comes in, it comes as falseness on the page. But whatever is inside you, of course, is shaping what the book is. But that that process of sitting to work hasn't fundamentally changed.
Okay, so let me put it this way.
Yeah.
That when you sit down and write, and you may have a really, what's the word that I'm looking for? Not relevant, but a very immediate thing that you feel strongly about, that you want to write about. Would something like what's happened in Gaza and what's happened in Palestine make you sort of rethink whether what you want to focus on is actually all that important anymore, is what I'm asking.
No, because if anyone sits down to write a novel thinking, I must be writing the most important story there is to tell, then I would have some concerns about the novel that would appear. I think it's a position of egotism. I think the way it works instead is if you are a writer and you have a certain position in the world, you do things like, let's say the last couple of years I've been working on a novel, and so I haven't been reading books to blurb, right? It's a big thing in publishing in the UK and the US. If you're a published writer, you have a certain name recognition, you get sent a lot of books that are about to come out, and people say, if you endorse this, it'll help. Who knows if it does?
Help who?
It helps the book. I think it's mainly the booksellers, actually. If the booksellers say, well, here's this book by a writer we don't know, it's a debut novelist, but all these other writers who we do know have endorsed it, they are more likely, I've heard from anecdotal evidence, to stock that book. So the last year and a half, I've been saying no to pretty much every book except any book by a Palestinian. You know, so it's more that, it's not that I'm going to use my position, now I'm going to tell the stories of Palestine, or I'm going to say, well, if I'm not writing about Palestine, I won't write. It's, my life as a writer involves other bits as well. It's the work I do with the Palestine Festival of Literature. It's adding my name to things. But when I sit down to write a novel has to come from the most deeply intimate space. And I write it because I want to write it, and no one has to read it. If someone decides, actually, I'm not interested in reading Kamila Shamsie, I want to read Muhammad Al-Kurd, I want to read Susan Abul Hawa, I want to read Ibtisam Azam, good for you. You know, absolutely, that's your right as a reader.
You recently moved from to take up a residency in Doha, right? And we were talking about this earlier. How has that feeling been, moving away from, let's say, London, where you've lived so many years, to a place like Doha, which may sound slightly off-center, but at the same time, in ways, for example, of the things that we're talking about, it may have a very different connotation, right?
Yeah, so I'm writer in residence at Georgetown University in Qatar. I've been there since last August. Prior to that, I was teaching at the University of Manchester. It was a relief to move to Doha because in Manchester you had student protests about Palestine that were getting shut down. There was a woman who was a Palestinian student who was very vociferous in one of the protests, and not the University of Manchester, but the Home Office, the UK government intervened just to say her student visa should be revoked. And you know, you're sitting in a room teaching people about writing while all of this is going on. It's a pretty horrible atmosphere to be in. And then I moved to Doha, and within weeks of my getting there, Georgetown University was having a huge Palestine conference where the basic assumption everyone who was speaking started with was there is a genocide. It wasn't a thing we needed to be arguing about. It was, this is the fact, and now we can move on to have a conversation. So that part of it felt very liberating. Having said that, I miss London. There is a depth and plurality to my life in London that I haven't yet found in Doha. And also that in London, I'm plugged in to a lot of people and institutions that are doing a different kind of work, and a work against, you know, that dominant narrative. And that feels like something I miss being a part of as well. So it's not a straightforward kind of thing. But there was a relief. There was an enormous relief in Doha to know that pretty much any room you walked into, there would be that basic agreement on the most fundamental fact that there is a genocide going on. Yeah.
And you've lived how long in London now?
Since 2007.
2007.
Yeah. 17
So
years before I moved.
I had asked my friend Mohammed Hanif once when he moved there, and asked him, I said, this must have been a huge culture shock for you to move from Karachi to London. And he had a really interesting response, and he said, actually, the culture shock I felt moving from Okara to Karachi was much greater than it was moving from. So I don't know, did you feel this? Or have you now completely acclimatized to?
I moved bit by bit. So I grew up in Karachi. I went to university in America. And I was in graduate school in Massachusetts when I wrote my first novel, In the City by the Sea. And it was accepted for publication while I was still there. Which meant from then I came back to Karachi. And I would always come back to Karachi and write. But then I'd go to London for a few months because something was being published or there was some literary festival or I was meeting my editors. So I did actually a lot of back and forth for about a decade before I knew that at the time there no longer is, but there was a visa for writers, artists, and composers. And because I was enjoying spending time in London, I thought, well, I seem to qualify for this. Let's go and see how it is. I think it's a very different kind of situation if you move to a place knowing you have somewhere else that you love that you can return to. Because it means that if you stay in that place, it's because you want to be there. So no, I think it was too gradual for there to be a moment of culture shock. I sort of went from holidays to visiting to a longer stay to being a resident and thinking, I think I'm going to stay, but if I don't, I won't. And then next thing you know, a long time has gone. For me, it's very interesting. I think the relationship between writing and place. So I lived in London from 2007. I think the first time I started to feel, what's the word? More deeply caught up in the place was when I was writing Home Fire, I started writing in 2015. And it's a novel primarily about London. And I found that as I was writing it, I felt not that I was writing about a foreign place or about some other people, but that I was writing from within. And more than any citizenship ceremony or anything else, or receiving a passport, it was that act of writing a novel about a place and feeling yourself writing, because I've written from outside about other places, to realize you felt that you were writing from within the place. Was I think when I knew my relationship to the city to London at least, if not to Britain, had shifted quite dramatically.
Actually, you brought up something that in one of your interviews, you'd said, I'm made up of books I've read as much as the cities I've lived in, right? And with respect to your mentor and friend Agha Shahid Ali, you also said that Kashmir was his home. His place was wherever he found himself, right? And then there's another element to it which you have brought in, which you said another friend of yours had mentioned, that you always find different routes to come back to Karachi, right? To write about Karachi. And obviously your earlier novels were all, a lot about Karachi, growing up in Karachi, etc. But even Home Fire, which was ostensibly about citizenship and belonging in the UK, circles back to Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
And again, of course, Best of Friends again has a very big element of. How do you see yourself? Is it some form of that this is what you know, or is it some form of nostalgia, or is it just something subconscious or unconscious that comes through in the writing?
I'm not sure I fully know the answer to that. And the moment where it really struck me that what am I doing here was With a God in Every Stone, which is primarily a novel of Peshawar. It has bits in London, it has bits in Turkey. There's a 2.5-page chapter in Karachi. And I was looking over the book recently for something that had to do, and I noticed this 2.5-page chapter, and I thought, why did I do that? Why? It basically what happens is there's an English woman and she's traveling to Peshawar and she becomes unwell on the ship that's bringing her in to port in Karachi. So rather than getting straight in a train and going from Karachi up to Peshawar, she has to stop in Karachi for 2.5 days. And I was trying to remember why I did that. And I realized it was because the plot demanded that her journey be interrupted. And it was just simpler for me to interrupt it in Karachi than anywhere else because you know things. As a writer, the things that are really important for you to know in order to write about a place are things like what is the weather like in May as opposed to November? What plants are growing? I don't know anything about plants. I'm terrible. But every one of my novel will tell you what is in bloom, what trees are around, whether they're in flower or not. I basically, when I'm writing about Karachi, I go to my mother and I say, so in June, what's in flower? Just 2 days ago, I was walking with my sister through Old Clifton, and I said to her, now, what is that tree? And she said, neem, which of course she's told me about with the last novel. My brain forgets these, but when I write, I remember. So partly it is simply that I know all this information that it's very useful for me as a writer to know. But I think it's much more than that. I think this is the first city of my life, you know. I went away from university, but I would still come back every summer and winter, and I would travel a lot, but it wasn't until I was 34 that I moved away. So there's a lot of the sediment of me, I think, that comes from here. And it is the context that primarily shaped me. And I think there is also something about getting older and wanting to go back and write about Karachi differently. You know, because a lot of those Karachi novels were written in my 20s. And again, forgive me those of you who were in the session yesterday and heard me say it. The reason, you know, there were 4 novels set almost entirely in Karachi. Burnt Shadows has a section in Karachi, but it moves around the globe quite a bit. A God in Every Stone is primarily Peshawar. Home Fire is primarily London. And I really thought, when I was writing those books, I thought, okay, I've done the Karachi novels. You know, I've moved away from it. And then a few years ago, I was researching researching an article on the history of Pakistani women's cricket. And which was, if anyone wants to look this up, it's called Strong Arms. It's on the Cricinfo website. It's one of the things I'm proudest of having written. And that story really starts in 1988, when there are these 2 sisters, Sharmeen and Shaiza. They've been playing cricket at boarding school in England, or maybe at university in England. And it's 1988, Benazir Bhutto has become prime minister, and they think, well, if a woman can run a country, why can't women play cricket? And the story takes off from there. And as I was writing it, I started to write, as part of that article, about what it was like in 1988 to be a young woman, as they were. And I just got goosebumps, remembering what it was like to be 15 years old in 1988. And I thought, I've never written that.
And you've done that, I mean, you've stuffed in quite a bit in Best of Friends. I mean, you've got the video stores, you've got cricket in there as well.
Yeah, so I think at a certain point it also becomes, by that point, I was in my 40s, you're writing in a different way about your past. So the early novels were all written about, not about a past Karachi as such. They were written maybe about a Karachi that was 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier, but mainly they were fairly contemporaneous. And this one, for the first time, was me being older, looking back at the Karachi of my youth and seeing it differently to the way I'd seen it when I was 15 or when I was 25, and finding that I wanted to go back and write that. I mean, it's interesting. One of the interesting things about being a novelist is that you change as a writer. And sometimes people say, well, if you could give one piece of advice to younger writers, what would it be? And I'd say, never define the kind of writer you are. Don't say, I write about Karachi, I write thrillers, or this is the writer I am. It's the writer you were yesterday, maybe it's the writer you were today. You can box yourself in by thinking, oh, this is this is what I do, this is how I must write. But actually, you keep changing as a writer, and you have to, otherwise you get stale. So it's a bit of a surprise to me to find that Best of Friends, the first half was in Karachi. The thing I'm writing now seems again to be a Karachi novel, and again of that earlier period of the 80s. So, who knows
So,
how
I
these
mean,
things work.
I know you told me
Yeah.
there are a couple of things you didn't want to talk about. But I mean, so actually, it's fascinating to me because the
I didn't tell
idea.
you, I think, Hassan, you dug out. I had told other people earlier.
Yeah. But no. The one of the things
Yeah.
that, for example,
Yeah.
I remember reading an interview of Hanif Qureshi, right? And after he wrote My Beautiful Laundrette, and so actually after he wrote his second film, but he said, after I wrote My Beautiful Laundrette, some friend of mine said to me, how come there are no lesbians and black women in your writing? So he said, I threw that in Sammy and Rosie Gets Laid,
Yeah.
right? Get Laid. But that sounded to me a very cynical way of approaching that. Oh, someone said, why haven't you done this? So he just decided to put it in there.
I think never believe what writers say about how they write.
Yeah.
Very often writers are also performing, and very often writers are saying the thing that, I think the truth about the writing process, no one has articulated better than Hisham Mathur. I was once this is Hisham Mathur, the wonderful Libyan British American writer, Egyptian, of many parts. And the interviewer said to him, so when you were writing whatever book, were you thinking X or Y or Z? And he said, when I write, I try not to think. And everyone laughed except the writers in the room. Because we knew exactly what he meant, which is that actually, of course, you're thinking. But I think, plugging into stuff that is in your unconscious, stuff that's at the back of your brain. You don't stop to say, why am I making this decision? If the writing is to feel alive, I think a lot of it has to be a surprise to you as the writer as well, or there has to be a sense of discovery to it. And often a sense of, why did I do that? So I think actually most writers probably, to some extent, work that way. And it might well be, when Hanif answered that in that glib way, it could be that actually he asked himself that question. That actually it would be interesting to. It would be interesting to have these kind of characters who I haven't, and how would I go about it?
Yeah. So actually, I want to come back to the writing process as well. But another question that, so one of the things that Kamila said to me, don't ask me where my ideas come from, right? But the other one that I chanced upon in one of her interviews was that she said the one question she wished would be written off the face of the earth and hates answering is about the idea of the Western gaze and writing for a Western audience. But this is something I've told her that this I want to ask her, because this is something that I often think about in terms of filmmakers, for example. There are filmmakers who were really good filmmakers and were sort of forced into exile. I'm talking about some Irani filmmakers, forced into exile and had to live in Europe or wherever. And their later work would just become really sort of a pale imitation of, not even of itself actually, it would be sort of what they thought was something that the Western audience wanted. And I wanted to ask you that I'm not even thinking in terms of consciously. I'm not talking about that you decide that I'm going to write something for, but when you're living abroad for such a long time, would it not necessarily sort of, I mean, your concerns, your things would change to wherever you are? I mean, the place that you live in is the place you're writing about.
Because I'm older, I no longer want to strike this question off the face of the earth, because I think there are lots of interesting elements. One, I'll say this. Whenever I speak to filmmakers, one thing they say is what they envy in writers is that if you're writing a book, far fewer people have money invested, and so you have a lot more freedom. If you're making a film, you have to get on board a lot of people with a lot of money, and they have to approve your project. And a different set of demands and expectations get created by that. Writers don't have that. We really don't. As a writer, I've been guided by who I have always been as a reader. And when I grew up reading novels, I was reading novels in the English language. I was not the audience, the intended audience for a single one of the books I read. C.S. Lewis was not thinking about me when he wrote the Narnia books. Enid Blyton was certainly not thinking about me. Nabokov wasn't thinking about me. Toni Morrison wasn't thinking about me, except in certain ways you could say maybe she was. The great thing about the novel is that it rewards both familiarity and unfamiliarity. There are people who come to my novels of Karachi, say. An audience here, I think, will come to those books for familiarity. An audience elsewhere will come to them for unfamiliarity. I think it's a fundamental failure to understand the novel, to ask this question, which assumes there must be one audience. If there can only be one audience, the book has failed. Because the novel, by its very nature, has to be capacious enough to allow all these entry points. Familiarity is one, unfamiliarity is another. But there's also what I've discovered in the many years of being a writer, what I hadn't thought about. There is that third area, actually, because a lot of my readers are readers who are British or are American or are Dutch or are Danish or whatever. Their parents are Pakistani. Pakistan for them is neither alien nor home. And they come to the book as well. So the books have to work as familiarity, as unfamiliarity, and somewhere in between. It should also be said, I think the greatest novel written by my generation about Karachi is a novel called The Sound of Things Falling by a man called Juan Gabriel Vasquez, who wrote it in Spanish. It's been translated into English. It isn't actually about Karachi. It is about Bogota in the mid-90s in a time of extraordinary violence. I read it, it is a novel of Karachi. You know, that is how the novel works. Having said all that, when I wrote A God in Every Stone, it struck me for the first time that because that novel starts with the First World War, there is mention of the suffragettes, and for the first, it did feel different to know that one very large part of an audience who've been reading me for a while, I would be writing a history that was familiar to them. What you find actually is that quite often it's that audience precisely who aren't sure they want you to be doing it. You know, I mean, there were there were a couple of reviews in England who said, well, it's all very well when she's writing about England. It's when she gets to Peshawar that, you know, the book picks up, because it's sort of, well, why are you writing about the suffragettes when someone else can? But I've always been happy for a large part of my readers to not know what the hell I'm talking about. You know, and I think you have to. When I'm writing about London, it's only people in London. It's not even people in Birmingham or Manchester. When I have two characters meet who are in London, who are Londoners, and one says, I live in Holland Park, and the other one says, I'm from Preston Road. You have to be very London to know everything that is layered into that. And anyone who is very London will immediately know what is layered into that. Anyone who is not won't. So they miss out on something. And they pick up other things in the novel. And that just has to be the way it works, is that no one is going to pick up everything. Yeah. And you shouldn't try and explain everything to everyone. You know?
Yeah. You shouldn't try and explain everything to everyone. Yeah. You know, I want to get
also,
back.
I want to say that sometimes books are more interesting if you don't understand. So growing up, Enid Blyton books, everyone was always eating watercress sandwiches. I made this point before, but it is a point that stands. And I used to think a watercress sandwich sounded really delicious, and then you find out it's lettuce. And the books are much less appealing at that point when they're just sitting there eating lettuce sandwiches. So, not knowing can make a book better.
I mean, I want to get into Best of Friends a little bit. But before that, I just want to ask you what is the, getting into the writing process, right? Is it about, I think you've talked about this as well at some point, the regularity of forcing yourself, the writing muscle as it's called, right? How do you force yourself into when you're not feeling up to it or you're not feeling inspired?
You know, how does anyone go to work in the morning when they don't feel like it? Right. I mean, the answer to that...
But it's different, right? In
well,
the sense that it's...
not if you decide it's not. So that's part of it is... someone was just saying to me, well, there are those writers who say I sit down and work every day, and then there are writers who say I wait for inspiration to strike. And I said, if any of those people saying I wait for inspiration to write is actually someone who has a sort of track record as a published writer, they are lying. It's that I know dozens, hundreds of writers. I have never met one who sits around and waits for inspiration to strike. It's not how it works. You have to do the work. You have to put in the work. I actually, I no longer feel that I want to remove from the face of the earth the question about the Western audience. What I want to remove from the face of the earth is actually the phrase writer's block. Because I think the fact that this phrase exists makes a lot of people think they're suffering from it. When what you're suffering from is you've encountered a difficulty in your writing and you have to work very hard to get beyond it. Beginnings, it depends also where you are in a novel. So how do you start a novel? It's the where do your ideas come from question, which again is actually not a bad question at all. The reason writers dislike the question is because we have a very hard time answering it, I think. I don't know where ideas come from. I know that when I finished a novel, there's a long period of time when I can't even think of writing anything else. I feel quite depleted. And then I'm reading more, or I'll be maybe writing nonfiction. I might do a short story. I'm doing all kinds of other things. And then I miss writing. And it's like an antenna kind of just goes up, which had retracted. And that antenna is looking. It is actively looking for where is the next novel coming from. And the longer you write, the harder that antenna has to work. I mean, the first few novels, there was so much stuff that I sort of knew I was interested in and wanted to write about. Now I have to do a lot more searching. And it's a mysterious thing that something will just hit the antenna. I don't think that's how it works in antenna. I don't think antenna should be hit.
Waves hit the antenna.
Waves, a wave, a thought wave hits the antenna, and you think, oh, that's interesting. I never write it down. And I'm not saying this is how other people should do it. I want to be very clear that everyone's process is very different. I never write down that thought wave. I just sort of sit. And sometimes the thought wave disappears, but other times you find it's sticking around and you're coming back to it, and other thought waves are now being attracted to it. And other thought waves, and you're starting to see how a story will form. As I said, it's not the most clear description of a process, but it's the clearest I can do. And that part of it, I think, is when this whole talk of inspiration and sitting around waiting for things to happen, that part of it is very much like that.
But do you have like a regular time in the day that you say, okay, this is my writing time? And
once I've decided what the novel is, then I spend a lot of time trying not to start the novel because, I'm enjoying not doing it. But once I start, then it is, I wake up in the morning at a certain hour, I have my cup of whatever form of caffeine I'm having that morning, depending on where in the world I am. I read my morning newspapers, and then I go and I sit at my desk. And I do that 5 days a week. I give myself the weekend off. How long I stay at the desk depends on the day. Starting off, I find excruciating because you're starting with nothing, and it's very hard. It's very hard to write when you can write about anything. You have these few ideas and they can go in all kinds of directions. The more I write and the further I get into the book and know what I'm doing, then it becomes easier and I'm writing more in a day and I'm sitting longer hours. At the moment, I'm deep enough into a second draft that literally I'm waking up in the morning thinking of the next scene. It's sort of almost before I know I'm awake, I'm sort of writing what I'm going to write that day. That's a lovely phase to be in, but you have to work your way to it. And the way you work your way to it is by insisting on 5 days a week. I sit down at my desk. Some days are good, some days are bad. Some days I write 100 words, some days I write 1,000. Some days I sit down and erase everything I did the day before.
So, so here's another question. I mean, I know I was messaging her while I think you were in Doha, and there was a response back from her after many hours saying that I don't check WhatsApp during my writing day, right? Now, here's my problem, right?
Yeah.
I have like a ton of books piled up next to my bed, right? Then there's a bunch of films that you want to watch, right? Or you think you should watch. And then there's all these series, and then there's social media is the worst because once you go down that rabbit hole, it just takes up so much time, right? Do you make a conscious decision to sort of block yourself off from all of these distractions?
So it's interesting, a few years ago, it must have been in the days when social media was really fun. Remember those days, Hasan? I had an app that would switch off my internet access on my computer, and my phone I'd keep in another room. And there'd be a certain number of hours where just there would be no... I don't do that anymore. I haven't done it for a while. I don't feel... I think maybe I'm better disciplined about looking at... and I use the internet a lot while writing. It's a very valuable source of information and to jog my memory for various things. Maybe I find it less interesting than I used to, or maybe I've just got much better at
Discipline.
doing the work.
Yeah.
I find I read less than I want to. I should, precisely because of that. I mean, that's when I should be putting all devices away, is when I sit down to read, because it's very easy when there's a novel that is actually demanding you to do some work in terms of reading. It's much easier than to just scroll a screen. So it's not the writing that I find gets disrupted, it's the reading.
Okay, so I think we're near the time that I just have one question about Best of Friends. So, I've read, not all, I wouldn't say I haven't read all of your work, but I've read quite a bit of your work. And one of the things that struck me about both Home Fire and Home Fire, by the way, I don't know if some of you have not read it, it's an adaptation of Antigone. And also Best of Friends, is how assured the writing has become over time from when you started out, and which is completely understandable, obviously, because you're evolving as a writer. And assured also in the sense that, for example, Best of Friends is not overtly political, but yet it is also, I mean, these are all the issues that are in the back of your head and also in the back of the characters' heads, which are informing how they're approaching their lives, right? But the other thing that I noticed about Best of Friends was, and I may have missed some stuff in the middle, is that it's the first time that I felt that you were dealing with sexuality, right?
I think Home Fire deals with sexuality.
Okay, maybe.
But yes. Yeah.
I mean, this seemed to me a much more sort of immediate. Is that awkward for you?
No, I suspect it was earlier. I think one of the nice things about it's wonderful to be a woman past the age of 40, I think. Or certainly in my case, that you become, I think, a lot more just easy in your own skin. And you know what feels important. And what you want to say. And if other, that question of what will people think, or it sort of stops being a question, I think. But also you grow older and different things are of interest to you.
Yeah.
I think is partly what happens. I think when I was, the first three novels were all about very, very young people. Broken Verses was, I remember my agent reading it and saying, oh, it's got adults in it. And I thought, God, to get all the way to 4 novels before you get on to adults. No, I think it has to, it's that point about where does writing come from? And when you say it's, I'm more deft at bringing in the politics and all that, the other. I think one of the truest things I ever have heard anyone say about the way the novel works or about how fiction works was an interview with John Hersey. And John Hersey is best known as a journalist. He was the first American journalist into Hiroshima after the dropping of the atom bomb. And he wrote an article for The New Yorker, which spanned the entire issue of The New Yorker. It's the only issue of The New Yorker ever without cartoons. And so he's known for his journalism. Hersey was also a novelist. And to him, the novels were what mattered much more. And someone said to him once, what is the difference between journalism and fiction? He said, with journalism, I can be given any assignment, and I'll go out and do it. But fiction, he said, novels have to come from very, very deep inside you. And I think the ultimate truth to the ways in which the novels change is very, very deep inside me changed. I think that is quite simply it. Yeah. And so that the things that are coming out onto the page are reflecting, what happens when you're, how old was I when I was writing Best of Friends? You're 47 in a pandemic as opposed to 21 in graduate school. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for the audience, and please raise your hands, and I assume the mic will get to you somehow.
I just want to say one thing, which is right after this session, I'm going to be signing books at Liberty. And I know that right after that, often people come as I'm walking off the stage. Forgive me, I'm going to be rude because I'm going to barrel straight through to the Liberty bookshop to sign over there. So if you want a signature or a selfie or anything, that's the place to come. I hope you will, by the way. That's not to put anyone off. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. My question is, as a writer, I'm Dr. Hussain Mari from Balochistan. My question is, when you want to write on sensitive topics, as a writer, what to do with a situation when your content comes in contradiction with the affiliation and ideologies of your readers? So as a writer, how to deal with such situation? Thank you.
It is a central question for writers, and I wish I had a straightforward answer. I think throughout history there have been writers who have written despite all that, and very often they've paid a heavy price. There have been writers who find ways to write through analogy. There have been writers who avoid it entirely. I would never tell a writer which writer they need to be. The fact is, things you write can put you in danger. It's just that simple. And I'm not here to say whether you should make that choice or not. As I said, a lot of people, a lot of writers throughout history have written in a roundabout fashion. They've written using metaphor, they've written using analogy. That has been going on as long as writing has gone on. And there have also been writers who've said it straight. And then there have been the writers who've said it not at all. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer. It is a central question, I think. It really is.
Yeah.
Thank you for this refreshing conversation. I just had a quick question regarding what guidance you can offer young people who want to become writers, aspiring young people, and what path they can follow to best pursue that as a career like you have.
So the first thing I'll say, which I say to, whenever I'm teaching, on the first day I say to my students, some of the finest writers I've ever known, you will never read because they never finish their novels or their collections. Whatever you're doing, finish it. Right? Get to the end, then you can go back and redraft. I would be incapable of writing anything if I thought my first draft is going to be the final thing out of the word. I write really, here's the truth. I write terrible first drafts. If my first drafts were ever sent to publishers, who didn't know that I could redo, then they'd sort of laugh. It doesn't make sense. Get to the end of whatever you're doing. And try to write the book before you start worrying about how to get it published. I think there's a lot of second guessing of this is what people want, this is what the market wants, this is if I'm sitting here or if I'm sitting there, these are the things I must do. Just sit and write. I mean, I'm lucky. I started scribbling fiction when I was 11. And the wonderful thing about doing something when you're 11 is all you're thinking about is the joy of it and doing it because you want to. And I think that is actually the ideal way to start. Even when I was in graduate school, I used to say, my ambition is to have one book published by the time I'm 35. I don't care if no one reads it, but I want a proper publisher to publish it. I want there to be a copy that I can have on my bookshelf. Everyone says now, you must dream big and manifest and all that. I think there's a lot to be said for having just a very focused, intimate dream. If you can exceed that, that's wonderful. But start off just with that. I want to write the book that someone thinks is good enough to bring out into the world.
There's a whole thing where people give you all sorts of formulas about how to write. And so one of the things about script writing is all sorts of things. The funniest one I read once was tear out page 33. Just throw it away, right? And then, apparently it works for some people.
Kamla, it was really interesting to hear you talk about what a readership is looking for in a novel, the familiarity and the unfamiliarity. For some people, resonance is the most important thing. Other people like to explore different worlds. But I was just wondering what constraints, and your publishers are in the UK. I was just wondering what constraints UK publishers put on Pakistani heritage or any other heritage writers. Do they want to exoticize? Do they want to place them in pigeonholes? I know other writers in England who have this problem, that they want to get away from writing a certain kind of book, but UK publishers want a certain kind of book which can appeal to a UK audience.
I mean, maybe I'm lucky that I started writing before anyone had an interest in Pakistan, so you could write what you wanted. And because I've been doing this for a while now, I'm in a position where no one has ever once told me the kind of books I should be writing. At this point, I can confidently say no one will. Right. I think that for a lot of writers, it's different. It depends on what kind of publisher you get as well. My editor has always published very widely. So she published Abdul Razak Gurna for many years before he won the Nobel Prize. She's published writers from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Pakistan. She just, she actually published my great aunt Atiya Hussain. I was very lucky at 21, I met someone who thought literature should be world literature. And I haven't personally found that. I think one of the issues is if you are a writer from Pakistan and you want to write a sci-fi book, I think that a lot of people say, well, but you have all this, there are editors and agents out there who will try and move you towards, writing what they think can help them learn something. You find a different agent, you find a different editor. It's not easy. If something is attached to, it's not a coincidence that Pakistani fiction in English was particularly interesting to the world around 2005, 6, 7. We're lucky that at the time we had some really extraordinary novels and short stories being published. But it was because Pakistan was interesting, and so the newspapers were interested in stories out of there, and you just get more review page than you will now. Um, that's just part of how it works. It hasn't been an issue for me. Again, I've been doing this long enough, and I've been, fortunate enough in the way my writing career has gone that I have complete freedom to write whatever I want. And it's only once I've written it that I hand to the publisher and say, here it is. I don't talk them before and say, how about I write this book or how about I write that book?
So, Kamila, do you read non-fiction, and do you think you'd ever write non-fiction?
I love writing long essays. I don't know that I'd ever write a full-length book because I think the joy I get in writing fiction is very particular. I have historically not read enough non-fiction, which is why last year I asked to be the judge for a non-fiction prize, the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, which was fantastic because I, sat and read 70 non-fiction books. At the end of it, I was gasping to get back to fiction, it should be said. But they were astonishing books. And of course, a lot of the boundary between fiction and non-fiction is far more porous. A lot of non-fiction writers are using the tools of fiction as well. But largely, no. Largely, I have a to-read pile this high of novels, and I never get anywhere near it. And then non-fiction is almost always what would come after I got through the novels, unless I'm researching something. If I'm writing a book that requires research, then I will read non-fiction around it.
So hi, I have a question of.
Can't hear.
Hello.
I have a question each. So Hasan, you used to do the film festival in Karachi. That's why I know you. And you stopped doing those for whatever reason. Can you please start again? We're like starved here.
Okay.
And Kamila, have you ever been inclined to write short stories? Or?
I do write short stories, would be the answer. I had a short story called Churel last year, which I think you can find online. There's a BBC recording of it, which I was particularly pleased with. Short stories are very, very hard, because within 7 or 10 or 15 pages, you have to create a whole world. So a lot of my stories are very obviously short stories written by a novelist, which means they don't quite work. So when they do actually work as a short story, I feel very pleased with myself. But yeah, it's a form I love.
Back there.
Hi, Kamla, Hasan, I really appreciate all your work. Kamla, I work with students and young people, and I really loved City by the Sea when I read it. I was also in my 20s when I read it. Hasan, you're a filmmaker, so this is a relevant question. There's not enough movies for kids, and there's a lot of children, young people in this city and country. So have you considered maybe adapting City by the Sea for film or movies?
So I'm a novelist, I'm a novelist, which means, and I'm very aware that screenwriting, script writing is a completely different art form. The truth is, Home Fire was first commissioned as a play. Someone asked me to write a play. My brain just went to a novel, so it ended up as a novel. If someone wanted to do it, great, but it's not my art form. So you might as well say to me, well, would you think of adapting In the City by the Sea into a piece of sculpture? That's how distant it feels from what I know how to do. So I'd be delighted if people did, but it's not for me to do.
Hi, Kamla. You mentioned, so this is part A and part B, but they're both short.
Okay.
You mentioned that you mentioned a writer who said he preferred writing novels to writing articles because he could write an article on anything, whereas with the novel it has to be something much more primal, coming from within. I know you write. I'm definitely going to read the Crick Info article. That sounds very interesting. But I know you also write for the Guardian, and you've been writing articles regularly. Do you feel the same way as that guy who said that, he's sort of given a preference from one to the other? And the other part of the same question is, do you employ the same writing practice when you're writing a novel to when you're writing on a pre-decided article topic? Is it the same time that you sit down to do? Is it the same process, or is it a lot easier?
nonfiction I find a lot easier. Because largely I'm working with the kind of writing I do. There are certain facts and I'm working with them. With fiction, you have a character. The character could go here, the character could go there, or the character could jump in the sea, or maybe the character can swim, or maybe they can't swim. I mean, it's just, there's a different kind of work. So it's interesting. It feels completely different. Sitting down to write nonfiction feels absolutely different. It doesn't feel like the same muscle at all. And partly because with Stanley Kubrick had that line about filmmaking, which is the easy part is knowing what I want to say, the hard part is covering it up. And the thing is, with nonfiction, you figure out what you want to say and you say it. It's much more direct and streamlined. So sometimes actually, during the writing of a novel, it can feel like an enormous relief to sit down and write an essay and do that very directed kind of more logical thinking. I definitely prefer the novel. I mean, I haven't written for The Guardian for years. There was a number of years I used to write columns. I came to find that very unsatisfying. So now I'll sometimes do long essays. And the long form essay where you can really get into something. I enjoy doing introductions to other people's books because it's an interesting way for me to engage with it. But I'm at heart just a novelist. If you said for the rest of your life, you know how sometimes they say if the rest of your life you had to eat only one thing, what would it be? Answer biryani. But if for the rest of my life there's only one thing I could do, other than be a social human being in the world, it would be write novels.
Okay, I'm going to take last two questions, one here and one over there. Yeah.
Thank you for the time. हसन जैदी साहब, अगर आप वही हैं कि जो पहले आप भी एक फेस्टिवल करवाते थे, मेरे ख्याल में कारा फिल्म फेस्टिवल, वही है मेरे ख्याल में. तो मेरा नाम डॉक्टर हीरालाल लोहानू है और मैं मेंटल हेल्थ केयर प्रोवाइडर हूँ. मेरी गुजारिश ये है कि जो आप फेस्टिवल करवाते थे, क्योंकि इस तरह के जो फेस्टिवल हैं, आपको पता है मेंटल हेल्थ को बहुत बड़ा जो है इसमें रोल प्ले करते हैं. तो वो भी अगर आप शुरू करवाते हैं तो मेरे ख्याल में काफ़ी अच्छा हो जाएगा, क्योंकि आपका एक नाम है और आपने उसमें काफ़ी सारे जो है लीजेंड्स भी यहाँ पर बुलाए थे, उनको दावत देते रहे. और वो स्पेशली जो है, जैसे ये क्लासेस के लिए है शो, तो फेस्टिवल, तो इसको अगर मासेस के लिए कर दिया जाए तो वो बेहतर है, ताकि जो हमारी पब्लिक है वो भी इसको ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा जो है वो इसको यानी कि एंजॉय कर सके या महसूस हो सके. और इसका जवाब भी मुझे उर्दू में दे दिएगा ताकि ये कम्युनिकेशन लैंग्वेज
आज थोड़ी देर हो गई है, कल से शुरू करेंगे.
ठीक, ये इसका जवाब दे दें आप फिर.
ठीक.
I have loved your books for years and years and years, and the best part about them is
ये जरा आगे करीब करें इसको.
the best part about your books, what I personally feel, is that you respect the audience's intelligence and you don't always spell it out for them. So the audience is free to interpret your writing. But is that challenging for you as a writer? Like, how do you give away your work and leave it for the masses to interpret however they want? Or does it bug you if someone doesn't interpret it how you wanted it to be received?
It's a really good question. I mean, there are often times when actually in rewriting I have to take out certain bits because I'm sort of making it very clear how I want you to read this, and I, end up taking them out. When you write a book, you send it out in the world, and there's an odd way that I always feel this sense of both loss and gain at that moment, because once I finish writing it, it stops being mine. There's a real sense of intimacy I have with these characters in this world, and it's gone once the book is out in the world. The gain is that other people read it. Sometimes people are much smarter readers of my books than I am. I mean, there'll be times when people come and talk about my characters and find things that once they tell me, I say, oh, yes, I can see that's in there, but I hadn't thought of it. And other times they'll interpret them in ways that are just really interesting and wonderful. There are also times when, of course, people interpret them in ways that disturbs you. Increasingly, I've come to realize how little control you have as a writer, because people will enter into it with a very deep set of assumptions. I mean, it became particularly stark when I wrote Burnt Shadows, and there's a section in 1983 when there's a young Pakistani boy and he goes with a friend of his who's Afghan they want to join the Mujahideen, and it's, I mean, it's kind of a fun thing for him as a young boy. And there was this one review in America that says, and this boy, he joins the Taliban. Like, it was 1983. And then he read that entire character through the entire novel as here was a boy who went to join the Taliban with everything that this meant. And you just realize that, well, there's nothing I can do. And so, yeah, of course, there are always some interpretations that are delightful, and some that you just sort of throw your hands in despair. But that's part of sort of the pact you make when you write a novel, is I don't get to control how this is read. And mostly I just find it fascinating to see how people read it so differently to the way I read it.
Thank you all. I just want to read one line which I found really interesting from one of her interviews. And she was talking about people writing about places, whether they write about the city they're in or the place they're in or elsewhere. And this is one Kamila's words. There are writers who've written wonderfully about places they live in, writers who've written wonderfully about places they've left behind, and writers who've written wonderfully about places they've never known. And you can replace wonderfully with terribly as well. Yeah. So thank you so much, Kamila, and thank you all for being here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I will be at liberty if anyone wants to come.
And